Thank you for listening to this download of Start the Week, presented by Tom Sutcliffe.
Hello. Thinking outside of the box is, I'd suggest, just a tiny bit overrated. Any idiot can do it, after all. Inventing a better box to think inside, on the other hand, is far more impressive. And that's one of our subjects today. The biologist Armand Leroy is here to talk about Aristotle and to back up the provocative subtitle of his book, The Lagoon, How Aristotle Invented Science. John Barrow has just published 100 Essential Things You Didn't Know about maths and the arts, and he wants to make the case for maths as both discovery and invention. And the educationalist Misbah Arif is looking for new ways to keep young brains thinking inside the box of the school classroom. We start, though, with Danielle George, who's giving this year's Royal Institution Christmas Lectures, founded in 1825 by the great Michael Faraday as an exploration of natural philosophy adapted to the comprehension of a juvenile auditory. I love that description. Danielle, you've called your lectures Sparks Will Fly, How to Hack Your Home. That's a title that might alarm some technophobic parents. Yes. You clearly think we should have a much less passive relationship with our technology.
Absolutely, yes. I think we should be encouraging everybody, but especially children, to get involved, to tinker and to play with electronics.
You use that term very early in your first lecture, to play with things. What's the connection in your mind, between play and curiosity and technological advance? I think
it's we learn so much just by literally playing, by tinkering, and failing as well. So if you play with something, you tinker with it and it doesn't quite work, then you can play with it again and increase your confidence that it will work. And a lot of it is about confidence.
You framed your 3 lectures around your own scientific heroes. Joseph Swan, who invented the light bulb, or at least a light bulb, yes. Got there before Edison. Alexander Graham Bell and Michael Faraday, who we all know. They presumably were fiddlers and tinkerers and players too, in a sense, were they?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, they tinkered around a lot, and their first experiments most definitely did not work. And it took a while for them to be able to just tinker around and to get their first experiments working, but that's how they learnt.
To your mind, are inventors unusual people, or are they just people who have sustained a kind of very ordinary curiosity for longer and just kept it going later in life?
Yeah, I think they're very ordinary people, actually. There's nothing special about the inventor other than they have the confidence to carry on if they get things wrong, just to keep going and keep inventing or reinventing until they get something that is right.
Now, essentially, your lectures are about, the stuff of everyday life. That's what you begin with. You're in a kind of slightly odd position, aren't you, as a Christmas lecturer? Some Christmas lecturers can take it for granted that their subject is arcane. You have to take your audience and say, look, you might be taking these things for granted,
Absolutely.
Children are so familiar with iPads and mobile smartphones and so on. You have to take them one step back before you can advance further.
That's right, yeah, and that's exactly where we start with it. For each of the lectures, we start with, like you say, the light bulb, the telephone and the motor, and just say, but have you ever thought about how they work and what they can actually do? So, for example, the mobile phone, we all just take it for granted. They're black boxes and they just work. But actually, how do they work? And then start taking that apart. And then once you realise how they work, what else can you do with them? So you can reinvent
your
them.
method of taking the mobile phone screen apart is to turn the Shell building on London's South Bank into a rather low pixel
yes.
mobile phone screen, isn't it? Now, did that emerge naturally from the process of deconstructing what a phone is, or did you have to sort of work pretty hard to come up with the idea of putting it on a skyscraper?
Well, we wanted to set ourselves quite a grand challenge with starting with a light bulb and saying, okay, what can we do with light bulbs and then wireless communication, so the type of things you'd have on your phone. What sort of grand challenge or sort of quite crazy challenge that you might not think of. Okay, well, let's try and take over a London skyscraper and make all of the windows into pixels. So like you say, a very low resolution screen. And yeah, so we came up with the shell building, who were very cooperative, and
a nice grid pattern of windows for people who don't know what the building looks like.
A nice rectangular grid pattern, yes, which makes a nice TV screen effectively. And and we played a computer game on it on earlier last week, last Thursday. So.
You're also dealing with technology, I mean, as well as dealing with technology that we're very familiar with and we rather take for granted, you are including technology that is absolutely at the cutting edge. You create in one of your lectures a feelable hologram, in a sense. I mean, just tell us about that, because that's right at the edge of what we know, isn't it?
Yes, yeah. I mean, this is the one, Lecture 2, which we just filmed on Saturday. And what we wanted to do was start with the mobile phone and say, OK, this is communication. Well, we started with Alexander Graham Bell's very first experiment, and then say, OK, we all take communication for granted, but in the future, what is it? How should we be communicating? And we're using two of our senses at the moment, sight and speech. And why aren't we using the rest of our senses? So why can't we touch somebody? Why can't we, give them a hug? Or why can't we share a meal with them? So why can't we share tastes and smells with them? So to take us one step closer to that dream, we have a hologram. We try and project a hologram into the lecture theatre with us, and we also share tastes and smells with them. So I get some of the children from the audience, and they come and share some tastes and smells with the
you also
well.
You also introduced the audience to the idea of the haptic cow, which I was very taken by.
Yes.
A great boon for veterinary students, this, isn't it? Because
absolutely,
it is essentially it's a virtual rear end of a cow.
It is, yeah, and it feels so real. I mean, I was very lucky. I was the volunteer for this, and it was amazing. So you literally feel like you are touching something that isn't there.
You put your hand into a glove, and
yes.
then there's feedback on the fingertips of the glove. Is
exactly,
that right?
yes. So you can have this sort of sense that you are touching the cow's pelvic floor, and then into the stomach, and then they simulate for the veterinary trainees. They simulate a pregnant cow, so to work out obviously how pregnant a cow is, etc. And it's so real. And then we turn this back end of a cow around, and all it is just a tiny robotic arm. And it's amazing.
Probably the cows are grateful too.
Yes, I think they are.
This development. Yes. I wanted to ask you before we kind of open it out. You have the idea of hacking there, which has ambiguous connotations. It can be kind of wicked and mischievous, but it can also be democratic. Do you think? I mean, we've been through a long period where the technology and software effectively disenfranchised us. People always complain you can't mend a car because you need to diagnose the software problems with it. Are we now getting to a point at which the software is going to let us back in? I mean, I would have said you needed huge amounts of knowledge to start hacking into a mobile phone. You seem to imply that you don't. That you should just have a go.
I don't think you do. Yeah, I think you just have a go. I think thankfully we are coming out of this sort of black box era, which we've been in for quite a while, with smartphones and tablets and things like that. And I mean, I certainly see it from prospective university students coming in. They used to sort of say, "Oh yeah, of course I know how a mobile phone works." But now they're like, "Oh yes, I know how a mobile phone works because I've taken it apart and I've done this and I've done." And we're sort of getting back to that sort of ham radio era where people do tinker at home again.
John Barrow, I wonder what you feel about this, because it could go two ways, couldn't it? I mean, specialisation of science can take people down a cul-de-sac in which they're nervous about straying on either side, or it can open it out.
Yes, there always were the amateur radio types, the kids who like to take everything apart. And so when I was very young, things like model trains or Meccano, the thing to do was to take your trains apart. If you could repair them, then you sort of went up a notch in the eyes of your schoolmates if you could repair their trains. But as you say, there then became an era where you couldn't do that anymore, that it was all just sealed in a box, just like if you open a laptop today, there's nothing you can do with a laptop and even if you tried, you would invalidate the warranty. So
that's the curious thing, isn't it? I think children, maybe they haven't paid for it, so they're much less frightened of breaking it in some ways. But Ms. Baer-Reef, you're very interested in the topic of how children learn and how they can be made to learn better. Are you looking at the young brain as an obstacle to be overcome, or as a resource that you can actually tap into?
No, I think it's definitely a resource that can be tapped into. And I definitely remember when I was younger, my older brother used to sort of take things apart. I think it has become more difficult now. Like, my iPhone is completely sealed. I can't even get to the battery, let alone, so I think there is that difficulty.
Of course, you can hack it at the level of software, can't you? And people happily do. Well, not me, but
other people. But I think it's great that computing is now coming back into the curriculum properly, and you've got young children in primary school who are coding, which I think is fantastic. And I think as that kind of continues and as they grow up, they'll be much more aware of actually what's going on in their phone and what they can do with it, and other, like other technologies, where's communication going to go? Because at the moment it might feel like so bizarre to think we could feel through a phone, but I'm sure a long time ago it would have seemed strange to be able to see someone through a phone, which now lots of people have phones in their pockets.
Well, it's rather, in your first lecture, you, in order to get people to be amazed by Skyping, you have to Skype somebody in outer space, because, as it were, just doing it to America wouldn't work anymore, would it?
Yes.
There is an inflation in regards to wonder.
Yeah, it's that question of, okay, how could I actually make this into a wow factor, because we're so used to just Skyping around the world, and even, we thought about could we Skype someone in the Antarctic or something. Well, even then, really, people would be like, oh, that's quite good, but is it that different to America?
No, meh. We're used to that. Armand Leroy, I was interested, one of the texts, the very central text that you quote at the beginning of your book about Aristotle, has a sort of different implication about children. He says this: we should not like children. He's talking about looking at cuttlefish and examining the interiors of cuttlefish. And he says, we should not, like children, react with disgust to the investigation of less elevated animals. He got children wrong, didn't he? Isn't the instinct to cut things open the very essence of childhood?
Yes, but it is also children who are repelled by squishy things. I think that we have to imagine him in the marble colonnades of the Lyceum, in front of a bunch of students, and these are young, gilded Athenian aristocrats, gilded youth, and he's saying, here, if you want to learn about the world, you have to get your hands dirty. There's a bunch of cuttlefish, go cut them up. And they're saying, I don't think so. And he gets exasperated, as any professor would, as indeed I have with some of my more squeamish students. I sympathise entirely. He says, don't be like children. Come on, go cut them up. There's something wondrous, something beautiful here in the natural world. He's
pushing uphill slightly at that point in the Lyceum, isn't he? Because the whole way of teaching in the Lyceum has moved away from the real world and into, as it were, abstractions. And
he's reacting against a long tradition in which in which people consider the natural world in a very abstract way without actually getting their hands dirty, which is most obviously in his great teacher, Plato, who had his own school, the Academy. And Plato is one of the great anti-scientific figures of all time. He sneers at people who observe the stars and actually want to engage with the empirical world. He thinks that true reality lies beyond the senses, some sort of ideal, perfect, unchanging world of ideas. And it is this notion that Aristotle has to combat if he's to get his own project, which is, I argue, science, off the ground.
You do indeed. I mean, most subtitles hedge their bets. Yours absolutely doesn't. How Aristotle invented science. It begs two questions. One, did it need inventing? Is science something that has to be invented? Is it a human artefact, or is it just something that evolves out of a way of thinking about the world?
those two things aren't mutually contradictory. Right. So it is invented, but like all inventions, it is a consequence of an evolutionary process, if that makes sense.
It does.
But in an incremental way. So, yes, you're right, the subtitle is bold, but it has to be. Because I've got two views that I should like to knock down. First of all, that science was invented in the 17th century by the men of the Royal Society. Secondly, that science was invented by the pre-Socratic natural philosophers, men like Thales and Democritus and Empedocles, who speculated about the natural world. So what they did was terribly fascinating indeed. The interests of the very early Greeks, the pre-Socratics, people like Empedocles, when they speculated about the natural world, they are beginning to edge towards something like science. But here's the thing, they're armchair philosophers. The essence of science is having both theory and then testing it by going out into the world and putting empirical reality against those your theories. And it is that what Aristotle does. And that is why when we read him as scientists, or those, if you are a scientist, you love him.
Okay, well, it's called the Lagoon because it's centred on this lagoon.
Correct.
On Lesbos, where he lived,
yes.
And that was where he did all of his data collection, basically.
Quite a lot of it.
So he's amassing huge amounts of information about things,
yes.
but in a way that looks to a modern eye very random, a bit Borgesian almost. Georges Louis Borg. He just sort of masses it all together, and he comes at it in various angles. So it doesn't look systematic in a way that we would understand science.
I believe that's because you've got an incorrect conception of science.
Okay, correct me.
Yes, I shall. So there are two ways of doing science, I would argue. There is the traditional way, which we normally think of it as what is called the hypothetico-deductive method, in which we have a very specific hypothesis which we test using a critical experiment. This is the method which essentially the founders of the Royal Society lauded, and which Karl Popper, the great philosopher of science, said that's the way we should do science. But there's another way of science which has always existed, which has gotten a lot less press until more recently, and that is big data science. It is about hoovering up all the information going and attempting to detect patterns and then inferring causal models from those patterns. It's the sort of thing that evolutionary biologists have done, and indeed cosmologists have done. You can't do a cosmological experiment, really. You can only look for patterns and build models and look for consistency between the two. And I would argue that that is essentially what Aristotle is doing. He's the big data man of the 4th century.
And he's basically run into trouble with the Enlightenment scientists. I mean, you described Francis Bacon brooding over Aristotle's works like a vulture over a kill.
Yes.
You think he suffered at the hands of those later?
Yes, he did. But it's quite complicated, because bear in mind that Bacon was certainly, he didn't like Aristotle, but what he really hated was the Aristotelians. You see, Aristotle for 2,000 years was the authority on the subject of natural science, and there's no doubt about it that authority had to be broken in order that men actually stop reading Aristotle and start attending to nature. That was Bacon's project, and he was right to do so, even though it was a nasty piece of work, by the way. But
you feel these things very personally.
I do,
that's one of the pleasures of reading your book.
I do. But because, as a consequence of that, of Bacon's black propaganda, we have forgotten Aristotle, how wonderful he was. Yes, his authority had to be broken, but we don't read him anymore. And I feel this passionately because, I'm a biologist with, as far as biologists go, a considerable interest in the history of science. And yet just, 10 years ago when I first picked up that book of Aristotle's, I thought, I didn't know this. I didn't know he was so great.
For any biologist, there's one big hurdle with admiring Aristotle, which is that he got something's massively wrong. The big case would be spontaneous generation.
Yes, he did.
He thought life could be generated spontaneously.
Yes, he
and in
did.
fact, he gives, at one point, a recipe for making oysters.
Yes, he
which
does.
Consists of pouring seawater onto mud. Now, the
a little
point
more
is,
than that, but not much.
but not much. Leaving it in the sun. You have to cook
Yes.
it a little bit. He can't possibly have done that test, can he? You write a lot about the things that he must have done. He must have cut things open. He must have been more experimental in that sense. but he didn't conduct experiments by saying, let's see if this actually works.
No, that's right. So, although I do want to big up Aristotle for his scientific method being the big data man of his day, there is no doubt that there's a reason why scientists do experiments, and Aristotle would have got fewer things wrong had he actually done them. And it's not that he doesn't understand the logic of the experiments, because he proposes thought experiments, but he doesn't actually seem to ever do them.
You do credit him with prefiguring some very important ideas in evolutionary theory. I mean, particularly the idea of inherited form.
Yes.
Now, you also write quite astutely about how people dissecting things will often find what they expect to find. How did you protect yourself against that possibility, that in looking back at a historical document, you would find what you knew should be there and indeed wanted to be there?
In Aristotle.
In Aristotle.
You know, that's very hard. And I should say it is especially hard, in all fairness, for scientists, because scientists have their own theories about the natural world, and so they're very prone, when reading historical documents, to finding predecessors in them and finding their own theories prefigured. That's why we make really bad historians, for the most part. I'm helped by the fact that there is, of course, 2,000 years of scholars who've been hacking about Aristotle at Aristotle, and remarkably still find new things to find in him. So there's a very good scholarly literature on it, but it is primarily, I suppose, just a matter of honesty. You have to try to understand him as hard as you can in his own way, rather than finding the things. And that's especially true, for instance, when people have claimed that there are pre-Darwinian thoughts in Aristotle, but actually I don't think so. I think that we are reading Aristotle in Darwin rather than Darwin in Aristotle.
Danielle, George, do you see Aristotle as a scientist or as an encyclopedist? They're two different things, aren't they? Now, anyway, they might not have been in Aristotle's day.
Yeah, I think as a scientist, definitely. But I'm interested in what you were saying, Armand, about how he invented science. And the word invented that you're using there instead of discovered. So do you make a big difference between invented and discoveries?
I suppose so. The commonplace one, that invention is to do with human artifacts, discovery is to do with the unraveling of pre-existing natural objects. Does that distinction include? I think of science, the scientific process itself, as an invention. It's a human. The whole thing is a human social artifact.
Yeah.
It's a technique that you have to arrive.
It's a technique and a set of techniques which has, of course, evolved over a long period of time.
Yeah.
Ms. Maarif, it's not a natural technique, isn't it? I mean, it's not the first thing a child would think, well, I've got two theories. I'm going to test out which is right by coming up with a variable. I mean, that's a highly sophisticated way of thinking about things, or am I wrong about that? Can children get to it?
I think children can get to it when sort of given clues or structures. I think they're very good at asking questions, particularly when they're younger, and definitely that idea of observing what's around them and trying to understand the world. And just thinking about Aristotle, you said, he made a big mistake, a failure. I think actually that's a really important learning point for students. As Danielle was saying, it's really important for the difference between inventors and people who don't invent are that they have the resilience to fail and fail again before they get to something that is new, that does work. And I think actually the idea of spontaneous generation and what went wrong there is actually a way of teaching children to come up with the idea of control variables and variables. So, okay, we see this happen, but what else could be causing this? How can we control for that and get them to come up with the method? And be
yes,
a
I suppose
scientist.
the problem there was Aristotle didn't do the experiment, and then the people that followed him did the experiment extremely badly, and so they thought they got confirmation of the results rather than the opposite. John Barrow, you write a little bit in your book about this distinction between an invention and a discovery with regard to maths. I mean, most people, I think, would assume the received opinion would be that maths is a discovery, that it is a reality out there, and that we, bit by bit, find our way to it. You seem to think it's also an invention.
Yes, I don't think you should think that. Most mathematicians act as though they believe that. But if you questioned them at work, they would not admit to it, except for a few people. There's a long-standing sort of rivalry between these two interpretations, and I've never been convinced that you ought to have one or the other. You know, I can see that suppose I discovered some part of mathematics, why couldn't I use that to invent some generalizations from it? So they don't seem to be mutually exclusive.
You might want to know which was which, wouldn't you?
Yes, my view of mathematics, which I find is useful for outsiders, is to use neither of these, but to just advertise it as being the collection of all possible patterns. It's a catalogue of all the patterns that there can be. And so it's not a mystery that mathematics works rather well in describing the world. It couldn't be otherwise. Otherwise the world would be patternless and chaotic.
Could you just spell that out a little bit? Because it was a fascinating phrase at the beginning of your book, the catalogue of all possible patterns. Again, it sounds a bit like Borgeth. But what do you mean by that?
Well, some of the patterns on the wall here, some are patterns in the sound waves going into the microphone, and some are the patterns on people's wallpaper. They're all around us, and it's a weak definition of mathematics because knitting is part of mathematics, and all sorts of other everyday activities like icing cakes. Not all patterns are profound and useful, but some are. And the remarkable thing about mathematics is that a very small number of relatively simple patterns enable us to understand an extraordinarily large amount about the universe. Remember, mathematics is an infinite catalogue of patterns, but what's so extraordinary is a relatively small number of simple patterns which we can understand can tell us, well, you know, almost everything about the things that we've seen and witnessed in the universe.
And it's coming into play with the thing that Armand was talking about, this big data sets type of science, particularly. I mean, it is exceptionally good at detecting patterns in huge amounts of data.
Yes. I mean, there was a revolution, really, in mathematics around the end of the 1970s, and it was brought about by the availability of small, inexpensive personal computers. So before then, if you wanted to study complicated, messy outcomes of the laws of nature, what I would call the Aristotelian bit of the universe, you couldn't make much progress. I mean, there were computers, but they cost millions of dollars and were controlled by ferocious research groups dedicated to block-busting problems like predicting the weather or exploding bombs. But all of a sudden, single individuals, you know, just like the school children we're hearing about, can experiment with complicated things with devices that are relatively inexpensive, have good graphics, and you can interface with them very easily. So the study of complicated, chaotic systems and patterns arose as a result of small computers being available for individual researchers. It's almost a mirror of what we were just hearing about from Misbah about being able to do things in school, and what we're hearing from Danielle about being able to take things apart and actually do experiments. So experimental mathematics came about in the 1980s.
We had the evolutionary biologist Andreas Wagner on a couple of weeks ago, and he said the computer is the microscope of the 21st century. The same point, I think, that once you've got this device that can crunch the numbers, you can find out all sorts of things.
Yes, that's exactly right. Yes, and I think that's precisely why it is that our science is looking so Aristotelian, because we are, as Wagner does, indeed, attempt to derive causal models from data, and that does look very different from the sort of simple mathematics which, you know, physicists have been traditionally doing.
What do Aristotle's mistakes teach us? What can we learn from where he went wrong?
I would come back to the methodological thing that he missed, which is the need for experiments. You see, when you have lots of data in a very complicated world and you're looking for patterns, the danger is you can often find the pattern that you're looking for, regardless of whether it's actually there or not. And that is the flaw, actually, today with big data science, and which is why you need experiments in order to then critically test those models. It was his problem, it's our problem too.
He's guilty of reading social arrangements into science, isn't he, as well? His theory of conception depends on, as it were, a feminine passivity and a masculine vigour, which he has read off social arrangements,
yes,
or cultural arrangements.
Well, feminist critics would say that. I'd like to say that he's driven by his own pure scientific theories, but I confess I wonder sometimes.
Yeah, you can fight that one. John Barrow,
I think you have to be careful even with the experiment, where Popper seemed to go wrong, and is not really very useful, because he claims you can falsify theories using experiment. But how do you know you've done the experiment correctly? How do you know that the data you've gathered has not been biased in some way? So you can never falsify a theory any more than you can verify it. All you can do is change its likelihood. And it might be that the likelihood becomes so peaked and so high that you regard it as being effectively confirmed, or the chance of it being refuted is so great you regard it as ruled out. But you can never falsify a theory beyond doubt. And you've got to do the experiments right.
Yes.
And the school children will appreciate this.
Ms. Barrow, if you want to
I think also
in.
Aristotle, with his failure, teaches us about the difference between cause and correlation, which is something, when you're working with children in the classroom, you know that some of them will be scientists and engineers, some of them won't. But what you want all of them to have is an ability to look at data that they get in the daily newspaper and actually look at it critically. So just on the news before we came on air, they said that benefits have gone down, and this has caused more people to go into employment. Well, actually, that's a correlation, and I'd like to see the evidence that that's causal, because it could be to do with many, many other things. And I think that's a really important lesson for children and adults to learn, actually, so that they really look at the world around them much more critically.
This is in part numeracy as well, isn't it, John Barrow, which I'm sure you would greatly approve of, the extension of numeracy. Now, your book about maths and the arts, 100 essential things you didn't know. You're partly talking about the functional application of maths, aren't you? I mean, there's a very interesting one about diamond cutting, that if you understand exactly how the angles of refraction and reflection work, you can make a much more beautiful diamond. So you get an aesthetic end from a mathematic input. Just tell us about that, because that was somebody who grew up in a diamond family but then applied maths.
Yeah, so that was Marcel Tarkowski, who was a student at Imperial, just down the road, in fact, in engineering. He was in a very famous diamond cutting family, and he came to do a master's and then a PhD at Imperial. And for the master's, he wrote a book, which you can still read on the web, on diamond cutting. And he just applied simple rules of optics and physics to the diamond. Diamond's unusual. Its coefficient of refraction is about twice that of glass, so it bends light very dramatically. So he tried to deduce what was the optimal shape, so that when the light goes into the diamond in your diamond ring, the maximum amount of light is reflected straight back out, rather than being deflected off to the side or not coming back out at all, because it refracts out the side. And this dictates the angles at the back and the shape of the diamond, and led to this brilliant cut diamond, which is what he proposed. And also diamond has a remarkable effect of dispersing the colours of the light falling through it, more spectacularly than Newton's glass prism. And this is what jewellers call the fire of the diamond. So if you wiggle it slightly, you see all these different colours.
Seems rather extraordinary that he had to work it out by first principles. Here's a deeply practical technology, cutting diamonds into brilliant shapes, which had been going on for hundreds of years.
But not his shape. So beforehand, it was a different type of shape that was used. So he revolutionised things by proposing a new shape that would allow all the light to come out in straight lines parallel to as it goes in. So he wasn't just explaining what was already known from experience, but using his geometry and optics to deduce the optimal shape.
The other great theme of the book is maths as an explainer of aesthetics. I found some of these absolutely fascinating. The one wonderful example you give in one of your chapters about the way a ballerina floats during a grand jet, or grand jeté, whatever. Now, of course, she doesn't, because it's impossible.
Mm-hmm.
But we're not wrong to think we've seen that, are we? And and maths explains why.
No, it's like basketball players that hang in the air, or footballers that hang in the air. Their centre of gravity has to move in a parabolic path, but that doesn't dictate what happens to their arms and their head and so forth. And they're able to move their arms and their legs upwards in such a way that the head follows a rather different trajectory and seems to stay at the same height for a short period of a second or so. And so they really do seem to be hanging in the air if you focus on the head of the ballerina rather than the centre of gravity. So it's a clever illusion.
It's an illusion that depends, rather interestingly, on our expecting the perfect parabola, doesn't it? I mean, so
Yes.
that's somehow deep wired in us, a knowledge of how things work in the world, and that mathematical curve is in there and can be tricked and can be
Yes.
worked round. The other example I like very much is how do we doodle? You would think
Yes.
that doodling would be free of mathematics, unless you were doodling geometrical figures or something like that. But you write about literally the curves that you make on a paper.
Yeah,
If
so
you're
this is
just-
a hypothesis of mine which may well be falsified in due course.
We need more data.
Yes, there's a number of chapters in the book talk about various types of smooth curve. So when people design curves, they're often smooth, for aerodynamic reasons, or so they look beautiful. And roller coasters is a nice one. The roller coaster is not a semicircular curve, otherwise you would get crushed at the bottom by the force of gravity and acceleration. There's a teardrop shape, which is called a clothoid in mathematics. And this has a beautiful property that if you're moving round it, the acceleration is proportional to the distance you've travelled. And that shape's used for motorway exit junctions, so that you can move your steering wheel at the same angular speed and keep the car going at the same speed without having to keep changing your speed.
As you slow down
Yes.
to come off. And then also when you're drawing...
And I
your
think when
hand
you're
is-
drawing, my inclination is that you would never doodle in a circle because you would have to keep changing the speed of the pencil. You tend to like these teardrop shapes because exactly the same principle applies. You can move it with the same angular speed without continually changing on the surface of the page. So if you doodle in teardrop shapes, that may be why.
Danielle, George, you must deal a lot with curves and such things because you work in radio frequency and radio communications. Does that sound plausible to you?
It does, actually. It's not a way I've ever thought about it before until I read parts of your book, and I think what's really great about your book, John, is relating the arts to mathematics, and I think mathematics can sometimes suffer in the way that engineering does, in that people, especially maybe teachers, primary school teachers, secondary school teachers, don't quite know what it is and how to apply it to the real world. And so bringing in this sort of extra dimension of, well, it is mathematics, but here are all the applications that you can use for it is a really interesting way of thinking about it.
Yeah, a lot of the examples, there were two previous books in this little trilogy, one about maths and everyday life and one about maths and sport. And lots of the examples were cooked up originally from talking to school groups and other groups of the general public, because there were kids in schools who they don't think they're interested in maths, but they're interested in sport, and so they suddenly find the two are linked, or they might be interested in music or in art, and they'd never thought there was any connection between maths and physics and the arts. And so it was a way of sort of attracting the interest of a different sort of student.
There is one distinction, isn't there, as we're talking about innovation. A young child could come up with an interesting app, or could come up with a new application of a mobile phone or hack a phone in such a way to make something interesting. A very young person could discover a new species. Mm-hmm. If you're going to discover something new in maths, you are inevitably, are you not going to be part of a very, very small elite?
Well, it depends. There are, if you are going to extend a long thread of research that's been going on for a long time, and solve the Fermat's last problem or something like that, you're not going to do that if you're sort of 8 years old or you just look at it for the first time. But you might think of a new type of problem. And that's one of the focuses of my book, about thinking about things that you hadn't thought of as a mathematical problem before. What's the best place to stand to look at a statue, or how big should an oil painting be, given the scales of it? Is there an optimum size? Why did the artist pick that size? And there are some artists like Pollock for which it doesn't matter, for rather beautiful reasons.
Yes, you've got to you explore the fractal qualities
Yes.
of Pollock. Ms. Arif, because we're running out of time here, maths is a particular problem, isn't it, for teaching, or it has that reputation as being the most difficult subject.
Yeah, it can do. I think it's a hang up that people can have, and they can get it from their parents as well. Parents are often quite happy to say that they weren't very good at maths, and I think it's great trying to make maths more real, which is what you do in your book. And going back to Danielle's point about making things real for students, so the work that I do at the STEM Education Centre London, I work with teachers to try and help them improve their practice, and one thing we look at is how can you make things more relevant. So I can teach a lesson to children and start the lesson saying we're going to learn about cell division, or I can say to them we're going to learn about cancer. And if I say the latter, I've immediately got the attention of all the class, and they will remember that lesson.
Is there an equivalent for maths as well?
Is there equivalent for maths? Well, I think actually the doodling, I'd like to start a lesson saying let's all doodle and then have a look at that. Why do we doodle in that way?
I think we have innovated then. We can claim at least one innovation from this programme. Thank you, just in the nick of time. Thank you to all of my guests. Danielle George is this year's Christmas lecturer. You can see those over the Christmas. Armand Leroy, his book is The Lagoon, How Aristotle Invented Science. John Barrow, 100 Essential Things You Didn't Know About Maths and the Arts. And finally, Misbah Arif, Professional Development Leader at UCL Institute of Education. Next week, just in time for Christmas, hedonism. But for now, thank you and goodbye.
There's more information about Start the Week on the programme's website. Go to bbc.co.uk, where you'll also find many more Radio 4 programmes you can download for free.
Founded in 1825 by the great Michael Faraday as an exploration of natural philosophy adapted to the comprehension of a juvenile auditory. I love that description. Danielle, you've called your lectures Sparks Will Fly, How to Hack Your Home. That's a title that might alarm some technophobic parents.
Yes.
You clearly think we should have a much less passive relationship with our technology.
Absolutely, yes. I think we should be encouraging everybody, but especially children, to get involved, to tinker and to play with electronics.
You use that term very early in your first lecture, to play with things. What's the connection in your mind, between play and curiosity and technological advance?
I think we learn so much just by literally playing, by tinkering, and failing as well.
Kind of very ordinary curiosity for longer, and just kept it going later in life.
Yeah, I think they're very ordinary people, actually. There's nothing special about the inventor other than they have the confidence to carry on if they get things wrong, just to keep going and keep inventing or reinventing until they get something that is right.
Now, essentially, your lectures are about, the stuff of everyday life. That's what you begin with. You're in a kind of slightly odd position, aren't you, as a Christmas lecturer? Some Christmas lecturers can take it for granted that their subject is arcane. You have to take your audience and say, look, you might be taking these things for granted,
Absolutely.
Children are so familiar with iPads and mobile smartphones and so on. You have to take them one step back before you can advance further.
That's right, yeah, and that's exactly where we start with it. For each of the lectures, we start with, like you say, the light bulb, the telephone and the motor, and just say, but have you ever thought about how they work and what they can actually do? So, for example, the mobile phone, we all just take it for granted. They're black boxes and they just work. But actually, how do they work? And then start taking that apart. And then once you realise how they work, what else can you do with them? So you can reinvent
your
them.
method of taking the mobile phone screen apart is to turn the Shell building on London's South Bank into a rather low pixel
Yes.
mobile phone screen, isn't it? Now, did that emerge naturally from the process of deconstructing what a phone is, or did you have to sort of work pretty hard to come up with the idea of putting it on a skyscraper.
Well, we wanted to set ourselves so if you play with something, you tinker with it and it doesn't quite work, then you can play with it again and increase your confidence that it will work. And a lot of it is about confidence.
You framed your 3 lectures around your own scientific heroes. Joseph Swan, who invented the light bulb, or at least a light bulb,
yes.
Got there before Edison. Alexander Graham Bell and Michael Faraday, who we all know. They presumably were fiddlers and tinkerers and players too, in a sense, were they?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, they tinkered around a lot, and their first experiments most definitely did not work. And it took a while for them to be able to just tinker around and to get their first experiments working, but that's how they learnt.
To your mind, are inventors unusual people, or are they just people who have sustained a...
Thank you for listening to this download of Start the Week, presented by Tom Sutcliffe.
Hello. Thinking outside of the box is, I'd suggest, just a tiny bit overrated. Any idiot can do it, after all. Inventing a better box to think inside, on the other hand, is far more impressive. And that's one of our subjects today. The biologist Armand Leroy is here to talk about Aristotle and to back up the provocative subtitle of his book, The Lagoon, How Aristotle Invented Science. John Barrow has just published 100 Essential Things You Didn't Know about maths and the arts, and he wants to make the case for maths as both discovery and invention. And the educationalist Misbah Arif is looking for new ways to keep young brains thinking inside the box of the school classroom. We start, though, with Danielle George, who's giving this year's Royal Institution Christmas lectures.